She set the little barrel on 2 split blocks beside the porch steps, while the bucket from the well still stood at her feet, the water inside it brown enough to hide the bottom. A pair of neighbors slowed their wagon to watch, smiling at the sight of stove charcoal, clean sand, and torn cloth laid out like sewing scraps against a sickness no one could see. One of them repeated the line already moving along the settlement, that filtered mud was still mud. Thalia kept working. The late rains had turned the yard soft. The sky had gone hard with coming cold, and if the ground locked before she found a safe way to draw and keep water, the boy in her house would drink whatever winter left him. The bucket water did not clear by wishing over it. Even after an hour on the porch, a yellow-brown haze hung through it, and fine powder lay at the bottom, only to rise again when the handle shifted. Thalia Benton, age 67, watched the drifting silt, while Eli, age 8, hovered near her side and tried not to breathe toward the pail. He knew that smell too well. A bout of stomach sickness earlier in the year had left him gray around the mouth and too weak to hold down broth. Since the spring, his mother was buried above the cottonwoods, and his father failed to return from a freight run downriver. The boy had been in her care. There had been no room for speeches over it. There had only been the cabin, the child, and the frontier habit of doing what the day required before grief could ask for more. Their place stood on the outer edge of an Illinois settlement, where the wagon track thinned toward timber and low ground. The well was shallow, lined with fieldstone and timber, good enough in dry spells and uncertain in wet ones. Late autumn rains had come hard, held too long, and left the ground so soaked that water had run where it pleased instead of sinking cleanly. By the 3rd day after the storm, the bucket rope came up stained. By the 5th, the water had turned the color of weak broth. By the 7th, even people who laughed first were saying the well looked wrong. Some trusted the coming freeze to settle it. Some pointed to a spring miles off, as if distance were nothing. The storekeeper praised bought powders and proper strainers that cost more than Thalia could spare. She listened to all of it, and believed none of it enough to stake Eli's stomach on winter talk. Before first light the next morning, she dragged a small cider barrel from the shed and turned it in her hands until she knew every hoop and stave. The wood was sound, the inside only faintly sweet, and the size was right for a method she could lift, clean, and mend without help. She scraped it out with a spoon bowl knife, scalded it with the last of the clearer stored water, and set it near the stove to dry. Then she cut circles from a worn flour sack and sent Eli with her to find sand. Not from the first easy bank, but from a higher, pale patch where the grit ran cleaner under the leaves. He watched her rub each handful between finger and thumb, tipping one panful back when it clung too much like clay. He asked why that much care mattered if the water would still be boiled. She told him that boiling could kill sickness, but it could not turn filth into something worth swallowing. Back at the cabin, she washed the sand again and again until the rinse water stopped clouding at once. She spread it on a board near the stove, then chose charcoal from the previous day's hardwood fire, taking only black pieces that had not gone gray and dead. Those she crushed inside a folded sack with the back of a hatchet until the pieces were small enough to work with, but not so fine they would drift through like soot. Eli tried to hurry the task by pounding harder. She stilled his hand and told him the barrel would do nothing by force. It had to work by patience. After that, she bored a hole low in one stave with a hand gimlet and fitted a short maple spout shaved down until it sat tight. By then, the room smelled of wet sand, fresh-cut wood, and stove charcoal, plain materials arranged for a serious purpose. She laid one cloth circle across the bottom inside the barrel, pressed smooth pebbles over it so the fabric would not sag, then added layers, washed sand, crushed charcoal, another cloth, and more sand above that. The top she left coarse enough to catch what first fell from the bucket. There was nothing grand in the arrangement. That was part of why people doubted it. Frontier folk often trusted what looked heavy, bought, or hard to explain. A barrel packed with household materials seemed too simple to stand against sickness. By toward midday, it stood on a stool in the passage between the main room and the back door, cool enough for the water, yet guarded from a sudden outdoor freeze. Beneath the spout, she set a wide crock with a lid nearby. The first dark run that came through carried loose charcoal and went straight to the ground. The second looked better. The third ran slower and clearer. Eli leaned close and asked whether clear meant safe. Talia told him no. The water would still sit, and then it would boil. The yard made the rest of the settlement witness to the attempt, whether she wanted that or not. A passing man with harness over one arm paused long enough to tell another that she was straining mud in circles. A woman from the lane-side well said cold weather would cure more than cloth and charcoal ever could. By evening, the phrase had reached full shape and come back to her twice over. Filtered mud was still mud. She spent no breath arguing. Her answer was in the kettle she set over the stove, and in the care with which she let the filtered batch settle under cover before bringing it to a full boil. When the water cooled, it still carried a faint smoke edge from the charcoal, but the heavy, earthy taint had gone. Eli drank with doubt in his face and relief in his throat. She did not call that victory. 1 cup proved nothing. Safe water had to remain safe through many days, and the weather had not yet become what winter intended. Fuel stood in the middle of every decision. Boiling water meant spending wood that might later be needed for heat alone. Thalia judged the stack under the lean-to, not by how high it looked from 10 paces away, but by armloads, dryness, and how cleanly the split faces rang when tapped. But she shifted the best oak and hickory aside for boiling and night fires, left the poorer pieces for daytime warming, and changed the order of kitchen work so one strong fire did more than one job. The kettle went on before supper, so the same coals that made the water safe could soften beans or heat broth. Even with that economy, each bucket carried a cost measured in split logs and kindling. On the 3rd day, the water from the well came up worse, with a greasy film and a root thread floating in it. That visible change told her what she already suspected. The rain had not merely stained the well, it had opened a way for the yard to wash into it. At dusk, she lowered a lamp near the well mouth and watched weak light rake the lining stones. A narrow smear of fresh soil showed between 2 of them, darker than the rest, and slick with recent movement. A section of the wall had slumped inward, just above the water line. Eli peered over her shoulder and asked whether the whole well might fall. She told him not likely that night, but a well did not have to collapse to turn dangerous. A little breach was enough. From then on, she drew only what she would treat that same day and covered every vessel the instant it cooled. When the sand layer needed rinsing, she used the last of the safer water instead of fouler fresh water, because dirt traveled by careless hands as readily as by seepage through stone. Fear began to narrow into method. That was how she preferred it. Fear alone wasted strength. Method spent it where it counted. 2 days later, she went to the settlement center for salt, lamp oil, and a small packet of tea, bought only because Eli drank more readily when hot water held a familiar scent. The storekeeper raised the matter before her parcel was tied. He had heard of the barrel and spoke of proper supplies in a tone that made plain who had ready coins and who did not. He named powders, a finer strainer, and a patent stone vessel from a river town. Thalia let him finish. She knew what remained in her flour chest, and what snow did to wagon roads. Anything bought now would still have to reach her, and then still have to be kept clean and trusted. She answered him without heat. Sickness was danger, she agreed. That was exactly why she was using a method she could inspect with her own eyes, mend with her own knife, and repeat with her own hands after dark in bad weather. She paid for the tea and left him leaning on the counter as if thrift itself were a personal slight. Outside, 2 women under shawls were talking near the hitching rail. One said the first hard freeze would lock the mud in place and leave the water right. The other said bitter cold had a way of cleansing what heat could not. Their voices dropped as Thalia passed, but not enough to miss the thought behind them. That confidence in cold troubled her more than the mocking ever had. Mockery could be ignored. False ease could not. Cold preserved as often as it purified, and bad water under ice remained bad water. Worse still, once the rope stiffened and the bucket rim glazed over, drawing enough to clean, settle, and boil would take twice the effort. She came home and changed the arrangement before supper. The barrel moved fully indoors. Bricks went under the stool to raise the crock off the drafty floor. An extra cloth was hung against the back door crack. A second covered vessel was set aside as reserve. The next morning, frost silvered the rails and edged the bucket handle white. The yard looked cleaner than it had in days, and that false cleanliness tempted the eye. Mud had crusted over. Puddles had hardened. The path rang sharper under boots. Yet when she drew from the well, the water remained the same thick brown, with only a thin collar of ice clinging to the bucket where it had scraped the sides. She brought it back without comment and made Eli watch the full routine again. Slow pour into the barrel. Wait for the drip, settling under cover. Then a measured boil. She also began keeping stricter count. One crock held what had been treated that day, as a smaller one held the next morning's share. Another held reserve for illness or a storm. Eli was not allowed to dip his own cup into any of them. She poured every serving herself. The ladle hung on a clean peg and nowhere else. The barrel itself demanded tending, and that suited her. After 2 days, the top cloth wore a brown skin and had to be boiled clean. After 3, the upper sand smelled stale if left too long without rinsing. On the 4th day, the spout slowed to a thread because fine matter had packed where the pebbles met the cloth. Thalia took the barrel apart with the calm of a person who had expected maintenance from the first moment she laid hands on it. She emptied each layer into separate pans, washed what could be washed, spread what could be dried, and replaced the charcoal entirely. As Eli hated those hours because the filter standing empty frightened him more than the muddy well did. She answered that fear with a second line of work. On mild afternoons, she set a broad iron kettle beneath the roof edge and caught later runoff only after the first dirty spill from the shingles had gone. That water was boiled too and kept separate. By evening, extra jars cooled beside the hearth, and the reserve line climbed again. After midnight, the first true cold came in. Wind scraped flat along the west wall, and the boards drew tight enough to click faintly at their nails. Thalia woke to it, fed the stove one of the better oak sticks, and checked the passage where the barrel stood. The outer hoops had drawn slightly as the staves shrank in the colder air. She wrapped an old strip of blanket around the middle to slow the chill and slid the reserve crock farther from the draft. In the morning, the well rope grated instead of bending. Ice held the bucket to the surface until she knocked it loose with a stick, and the water below rose more sluggish and more opaque than before. Carrying it back, she felt the change in her wrists. Water had not become impossible. It had become expensive. She answered not by hoping harder, but by beginning earlier, filtering sooner, boiling before dusk, and keeping one kettle always warming, so a fire already built did not have to be built twice. The settlement divided itself more sharply after that. Some households began covering wells better and treating what they drew with more suspicion. Others continued to trust freeze, prayer, and luck in that order. The storekeeper discovered a market in small packets of alum and spoke more sharply than before about homemade measures. Thalia trimmed the lamp wick shorter, used daylight longer, and kept the table near the window so she could watch the barrel drip without spending extra oil. One evening, Eli asked why geese on the creek and the neighbor's dog could drink from any puddle while he had to wait through cloth, sand, charcoal, settling, and boil. She told him animals lived by what their bodies could bear and died by it too, only not always where people noticed. Then she gave him the chain of reasons he could hold in his head. The cloth caught what it could catch. The sand slowed what should be slowed. The charcoal helped with foulness and taste. The waiting dropped what weight could fall, and the boiling guarded against what no eye could see. So the next test came from the barrel itself. After a week of steady use, a wet bead appeared under the lower hoop, and by morning had grown into a thin leak, darkening the stool below. Water was escaping before it should. Thalia tipped the remaining batch into the boiling kettle and set the barrel on its side. The seam had opened no wider than a fingernail, likely from repeated swelling and shrinking. A bought device might have gone useless over less. Her own could be mended. She warmed beeswax saved from candle stubs, worked in a little tallow, and pressed the mixture into the opened seam after the wood had dried by the hearth. Then she tapped the hoop down with a wooden mallet, carefully, not enough to split the stave, only enough to close what cold had widened. By supper, the leak had stopped. Tahi'ili ran a dry finger along the repair and looked so plainly relieved that the room felt easier for it. The woman from the lane-side well came the following afternoon, carrying an empty crock under one arm and a look that mixed fatigue with reluctance. The sickness in her house had not turned grave, but it had settled in stubbornly enough to frighten them. She did not ask Thalia to call her wise. She asked whether charcoal truly mattered and whether the layers had to stand in that order. Thalia answered exactly. She showed the washed sand, the cloth circles, the pebbles that kept the bottom from choking shut, and the difference between black charcoal and gray ash. She also made the labor plain. The barrel was not a trick. It had to be rinsed, reset, watched, and boiled after. Safe water was not made by one clever afternoon, and it was kept by repeated care. The woman listened without defensiveness, because fear had worn the pride down enough to let instruction in. Before leaving, she borrowed a spare cloth and promised to send it back clean. Then the first real snow arrived. At dusk, it came as sifted dust that only whitened the edges of the yard. By midnight, it drove harder, low and sharp over the open ground, filling the track and smoothing every rut into one pale sheet. Thalia had prepared for that day more carefully than for any mocking tongue. The reserve crock stood full. The second crock, treated the day before, cooled under its lid on the back shelf. One more filtered batch waited its final boil. She moved all three closer to the stoveroom so they could be reached without opening the outer door more than necessary. Sometime in the darkest hours, she found a thin skim of ice around the settling crock and broke it off at once, then fed the fire with one of the best oak sticks she had set aside for true need. This was true need. Frozen water could not be filtered well, and repeated thawing could ruin the order she depended on. By near dawn, the door would open only after she shouldered it twice against the drift. The well lay under a smooth, white hump, with no trace of the bucket path left. Digging to it in that dark cold would have wasted strength and invited a slip against ice-hidden stone. She shut the door again and looked first at Eli, then at the stove, then at the reserve water. That sequence decided the day. They would live on what had been treated before the storm, and on what little more could be finished indoors from buckets already drawn. The plan would now stand or fail. It held because every flame was made to do several tasks. The strongest fire of the day boiled the settled batch, heated the room, and softened beans for supper all at once. Eli drank slowly and waited for the old, earthy taste that did not come. Fear had not left him, but the method had grown familiar enough to stand between him and panic. On the second day of the storm, the difference between preparation and trusting luck became visible even from the window. The Laneside family showed no desperate trips through the drift, which likely meant their copied method and extra covered water were serving them. The house across the track, which had believed ice alone would cure a bad well, showed constant movement. Doors opening, pails carried half-covered, hurried steps where none of the footing could be trusted. Inside the cabin, Eli's fear changed from taste to amount. He watched the crock levels too closely and counted cups before Thalia did. She noticed and changed what he could see. The reserve vessel stayed covered unless she was pouring. She gave him a task with certainty attached to it, wiping each lid dry and hanging the clean ladle back on its peg. A child who only waits becomes frightened by waiting. A child given a place in the work has somewhere to set that fear. When the storm finally broke, it broke into a brittle stillness that made the cold feel even harder. Thalia dug first to the woodpile, then to the path, then at last to the well. Snow came away in heavy blocks. The rope had frozen where it hung and had to be thawed indoors before she trusted it not to fray. But when she finally lowered the bucket and brought it back up, the water beneath the ice was still brown, perhaps a shade lighter in the weak winter light. Perhaps not. The color mattered less than the fact that it had not righted itself merely because the ground had gone hard. She did not take pleasure in being correct. She felt steadier for it. Wrong hope was more dangerous than bad water because it persuaded people to stop working just when care was most needed. After that came the long, true part of winter. Not dramatic, not brief, simply relentless. Days turned into a discipline of fetching, filtering, settling, boiling, covering, and counting. Thalia replaced the charcoal every few days, always from clean hardwood, burned hot and black. She kept a basket of washed sand dry near the hearth, and she cut fresh cloth circles from the least worn part of an old shirt. Eli learned to announce when the spout slowed enough to mean the top layer was clogging, or when a lid had been set too near the stove and might gather ash. He remained a child, still tiring at dusk, and still pressing close when wind struck the window panes, but he became a useful witness to method. That mattered. Children living on a frontier learned survival, not as a set of grand lessons, but as the memory of repeated, careful acts performed in weather that punished forgetfulness. The woman from the lane-side well came later with a sack of cracked corn by way of thanks, and with quiet news from around the settlement. Her own household had improved once they stopped trusting settled-looking water alone, and another neighbor had begun boiling every drawn bucket after his youngest child took sick. More lids had appeared on crocks. More ladles hung high instead of lying in wash basins or on tables. The lesson had started at Thalia's barrel, but was spreading in the frontier way, stripped of praise and passed along as common practice. That suited her better than admiration would have. Praise warmed nothing. Useful habit did. Each household still had its own luck and losses, but fewer people now spoke as though winter itself were a servant that could be counted on to finish neglected work. Proof mattered most inside her own walls. Eli's face filled back out. He stopped pausing over each cup as though smell alone could save him. One evening, he asked whether water would always have to be watched so closely, even when the weather turned kind again. Thalia told him that anything drawn from the earth and carried through human hands required watching. Water, flour, roof seams, firewood, feed. The world did not become safe because one week went well. It became livable because care was renewed before trouble returned. He did not take all of that in, but he took enough. The next morning, he checked the clean cloths before breakfast without being told. To her, that was as meaningful as the full reserve crock. Survival on such ground depended not only on having methods, but on having those methods remembered by the people who would need them next. By late winter, the well began to change without ever fully apologizing for the months before. The heavy brown softened to tea color after a stretch of clear cold, then deepened again during a brief thaw, then lightened once more. Thalia lowered a white crockery chip in a test bucket one afternoon to judge how far it stayed visible. When it could be seen at a reasonable depth, she allowed herself no triumph, only adjustment. The filter remained in use. The water still settled. The boil still finished the work. A method proved by hardship was not discarded because conditions had improved somewhat. More than once, she thought of what would have happened had she waited for freeze, as others urged her to do. There would have been weeks between that first bright frost and this slow clearing, when the water still looked wrong and still carried what a weak stomach should not face. Eli might have paid for those weeks with his strength. When thaw finally reached the settlement in earnest, it came by inches. Longer drips from the eaves, softer ground by the woodpile, and a change in the smell of the yard from iron cold to damp earth. The cabin still stood. The wood stack was low, but not gone. The barrel still held sound after one last tightening of the hoops. Thalia carried it onto the porch on a mild afternoon and let sun strike the staves for the first time in months. Eli stood beside her with a dipper of the newest boiled batch and drank without making a face. That was proof enough for him. For her, the proof had been longer and quieter. No second bout had taken his strength. No week of storm had forced her to trust a bad well, because nothing safe had been prepared in time. Common materials, used with patience and tended without vanity, had done what scoffing could not. By spring, the phrase about filtered mud still lingered in the settlement, but not as laughter. Yet it had become a rough reminder that contempt was a poor substitute for method, and that Thalia Benton had been right to begin the work before the ground froze hard enough to punish everyone else for waiting. If this frontier story earned your time, please subscribe for more.